All right. So again, Tasha O'Malley. I actually teach here at Prairie High School. I'm a science teacher in heading into my 9th year as a teacher. I'm also a member of our equity team, which looks kind of different in different places. And so the way that equity work works for me here at the high school is that we're like a group of teachers and support staff, and we are kind of putting the pressure on to make change. And so that's kind of where this session and kind of where my journey's kind of taken me to start thinking about the gaps in the racial consciousness of my staff or of my colleagues and of my people, like my parents and my friends and just like the people in the grocery store. And so that's what kind of led me to this session when Heather proposed this summit, thinking about gaps. And so for me, it was a gap in racial consciousness for myself. Like thinking about I as a white woman who has lived and grown up in mostly white towns and lived in white spaces. I have a white husband, so I have white children, right? Like that list keeps going on and on and on. And so thinking about where do I get my worldview from, and how, what do I do with that, and what does that mean for me then as an educator and as a human being living in a society where I shouldn't be the default or the reason or the end all be all. So that's kind of where this is coming from, this session. That's not going to work. I think that I always like to have some kind of agreements or a place where we're going to come together with. And so I lean a lot on the Pacific Education Group, their kind of just norms for having courageous conversations, because that's what we're having really all day today is going to be a big courageous conversation. I really like using this compass, so thinking about where you're coming into a conversation. So are you really believing something? Are you believing that your race doesn't matter, that your race hasn't had an impact on your life? Are you thinking about what are those experiences that I've had that maybe I'm thinking about them differently now? What does that look like? Are you feeling guilty? Are you feeling excited? Are you feeling I don't know what feelings, I have all of them? Because I know that's I sometimes get in that space. And then last, are you in the doing? What am I going to do about this right now? The way this compass works, though, is first to come in and figure out where you are. Also, if you're in a conversation with somebody, figure out where they are. Because if they're not very much in a thinking space and you're in a feeling space, you guys could be clashing, right? You could be having this conversation where it's not going anywhere. So thinking about where someone else is. And the last way to use it is to get centered. So we can't be ready to do something without having, knowing what we believe about it, knowing what we feel about it, and what we think about whatever that is we're trying to do, especially when we're talking about race and racism in the United States and in schools. So kind of working your way all the way around, how to go through all 4 quadrants then to be ready to do. Then some agreements, so just staying engaged. I think the stay engaged one is really integral to how I know I have work to be done. So where in a conversation am I checking out? What are we talking about? Are we talking about discipline? And I'm ooh, that email has to be checked right now. Well, that's because maybe I was uncomfortable with what that discipline conversation was. So places where you feel disengaged, that might give you some insight into maybe a bigger conversation to be had. Experiencing discomfort. This is going to be uncomfortable. I know for me as a white woman, I had never, literally saying that statement took me probably months, right? That was really difficult for me to be okay saying that, to acknowledge race, and that race is a good thing to acknowledge because that's who we are as people. So experience that discomfort, lean in. It might get uncomfortable, but that's kind of where the most growth is done. Speak your truth, and when we speak our truth, you're only speaking for yourself. So I'm only speaking for myself. I am a white woman educator. I'm a white mom. That's who I am. But I'm speaking for my experiences, and I recognize that my experiences aren't everyone's. And so when I say this is what worked for me, or this is the idea that I came to after this experience, that's for me. And same for everybody else. So you can't speak for your whole demographic. You can't speak for your whole gender. That's just not something that we can do. So speak your truth, and then know that other people are speaking from their personal experiences. And then expect and accept non-closure. I always lean on Dr. Bettina Love. She is a world-renowned woman in education and educational equity, and she always says that if this could have been solved, if racism in education could have been solved, she would have already sent the email. It'd be done. she would have gotten it. So that doesn't happen, so we have to expect and accept that this is not going to be finished today. That was a big deal for me too, to learn that my racial consciousness journey can never be done. I'm always learning, relearning the places where I was missing something, or I didn't see this, or I now understand that. So it's never done. There is no kind of final checkbox. So what are we going to do? First, we're going to talk a little bit about awareness. We're going to talk about some characteristics of white culture, and then kind of where do they show up in your space. So if you're a teacher, where do they show up in teaching? If you're a parent, parenting, or whatever space you occupy. And then just a conversation around what do we do next. I would like this to be the most talking in front of all of you that I do. Even as a teacher, I don't like lecturing, so I would like this to be more of a conversation, and as a group, or again, a little bit of a big group, but that's okay too. Just a really a digging into what do you know and what have you seen in your experiences, and then what can we move forward. And I'll give you guys the slides when we're done. There's a link to it. I just have learned that people have the answers if I give you the slides ahead of time, and they look ahead. So I will give these to you when we're done. Well, the first question might be one we've had before, but I want us to think about what percent of your life is impacted by race. So 0% to 100%. So just kind of think about what is a number? What would you put that number at? And then talk about people that are near you. Kind of where do you put your number? How did you place yourself there? Maybe introduce yourself to them too. Whoever. Is that all you needed to have going?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I'm the iPad checker.
Perfect. iPad is going.
Where are your mom? Well, they the ice cream. And I enjoyed it because I got to learn about others.
Alright, take 30 seconds, wrap her up.
I suppose. Yeah. I mean,
Alright, so everybody that wants to share, thinking about what your number was and how you got there. Anybody brave today? 10:15 in the morning. Yeah, go ahead.
My first reaction was like, oh, 100%. Everything, everything is impacted by my race or by others' race. And then my realization was at one point I believed 0%. Like to be, that's like the racial consciousness, right? Is to be unaware, is you really think race doesn't impact me, and to hear that narrative in the news or from other people too, of race doesn't impact me, so stop making a big deal of it, is very interesting. And to think that a lot of people are at 0 or 100 maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else want to share kind of what their thoughts are? Yeah.
So I said about 95%. Like I would say 5% of the time I'm in my house, and when I'm at home, I'm comfortable, I'm safe, and so it doesn't impact me. But the rest of the time, we was having a conversation. I said something as little as taking the garbage out.
Yep.
I live in some Prairie, in a predominantly white area, and my neighbors are always changing. So even taking the garbage out, I have to fear somebody thinking I don't belong or I'm trespassing and calling the police. So like I have to go out of my way to speak to my neighbors and make sure my neighbors see me and know I belong, where somebody else don't have those same considerations. So
Yeah.
To piggyback on that, just kind of be like on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of where I go and what I do. I don't ever have to think about, I wonder if that'll be different for me because I'm white. I don't ever have to think about that. But I'll take that back. Unless I am in a neighborhood that is predominantly non-white. And then I think they think I don't belong there. Or who do they, why do they think I'm here? And that's happened as I was a social worker in the past. And they would get guarded because I was like representing some agency, and that changes the dynamic in a big way. But like when I think about how it impacts my thinking about race, like that has just been this curve, huge curve in the last few years, and I'm like trying to think about my life and my world and what I do as a teacher through that lens. That like that's not everybody's experience.
Right. Yeah.
So it's changed me a lot.
How many are educators in here? Most people. So then, like, work in school, like would there be like social work, working schools, like community school type stuff, and then anybody like parents? So then there's overlap, right? Community advocates. I never know what to call that group, right? Because that's like everybody though, right? Like, okay. So yeah, like that is, and then when I touch this, but it doesn't work. Yeah, Lisa, you bring up a really good perspective that I haven't thought about before, because like when I've done this activity before, like, and then I was kind of taught this activity, the answer is 100. But you're right, like there can be spaces where, like in your home, that like you're in this like safe space, and like that's where, like who you are as a person. So like when we leave our rooms, like that place though, 100% when we think about every single person. I know for me as an educator, this was hard to imagine in my classroom. Right, because I was raised by teachers actually, and to like honor people and the hard work that they do, and everyone is the same in my white town of Milton, Wisconsin, like and my life experience showed me that too, because we didn't have very much diversity, and the kids that were not white in my schools didn't like act any different than any of my other friends. And so now as an adult and getting back in touch with some of those people, they're like, yeah, like we had to, right? Like to survive in that space, I had to act like that. And so that's been really hard, and like that's uncomfortable to unpack. Like I thought we were friends and we never talked about race. And like, I don't think we really were friends, right? Like we were like surface level acquaintances. But I wasn't willing to recognize that my race was impacting my educational experience and their educational experience, and everyone's differently. So then when I start thinking about now, what can I do to then recognize that? What can I do to then raise the racial consciousness of my own children and my students, right? Like when we're thinking about racial consciousness, and that's where the gap for me comes in. Like we're all have this gap of like thinking about like as white people, like how does that impact us? And I think that kind of leads us into thinking about how race has impacted you over your life. And so really easy, and that is an easy question to ask, hard maybe to answer. Thinking about what your first memory or experience with race or racism was, and then what's your most recent. So thinking about your first, for me, I think like my very first goes back to high school, which then for me now in like my like state now, I'm like, that's a really long time. Like I was like 16-ish maybe, right? Like I was pretty old. It was a basketball game, so I was on our basketball team. We played a Milwaukee team. So we invited Milwaukee, Washington, and now I know, like now, because I'm an adult, and my dad was our basketball coach, and he sought out other teams. We had a history of getting to the playoffs and getting trounced by Division I schools. Just like, because we were little old Milton playing little old farming towns, we would just get trounced. So he as coach was like, we need to play other teams, right? Like, we need to play bigger schools. So that led us to Milwaukee, who we would see in playoffs. So Milwaukee, Washington said they would play us. I now know our athletic director said that he was not allowing our bus of white girls to go into Milwaukee, so they had to come to us. I now know that. I'm like, that just adds a layer, right? But I will now that I've like unearthed this memory, will never forget driving up to my high school, and there was a line of police cars that lined the front of our building. We were pretty good. We were good. Like, we went to state tournament. Like, we were a good team, and there were more police officers there than fans, right? Like, what did my school teach me about race and racism? The girls that came it was an all-black team. They brought a fan bus. Actually, I don't even know if they might have been on the bus with the girl. I don't know. Like, they had some fans, like parents and a couple students. Like, super nice people. Like, nothing happened, right? Like, I don't know what we all thought or they thought was going to happen. The other thing I remember is that someone on our team, or I don't know how, decided to change our warm-up music. So we usually had the band. Band wasn't there. Clearly, they were not allowed to be there. But we also had like a warm-up tape that had, like a mix. Country, hip-hop, whatever was played in the early 2000s. Our warm-up music became the most like yeehaw country songs ever. Like, our girls did not listen to that music, but that is what was played as our warm-up music. We were like, what is going on? Now looking back, what were we being taught, right? Like, that is the thing for me, like, being taught, we're teaching children about race and racism every single day, even, like, especially as white people. And so, for me, that is, like, unearthed this, like, idea of, like, I was being taught. I was raised in a racialized education system. For me, then, my most recent was at my own house, and I have to still unpack that a lot. We have neighbors, and on the 4th of July, we have people over to our house, and I have friends of color. And I had one woman was at my house, and she is a black woman, and she was sitting at the table, we're eating. One of my neighbors comes up and goes, hey, I've met, hey, says hi, and then says, I've met you before, right? You were here last time. She was not at my house last time. Like, the last time at a party, she was not at my house. And the woman that he was conflating her with, like, completely night and day color-wise. Like, they are both black women, one very much more, like, lighter skinned than the woman that was in my house right now. Look nothing alike. Demeanor, nothing alike. Hair, nothing alike. Right? And so, she was like, I don't think we've met. And I was like, I don't think you were here last time. Like, last time I don't think you were here. And she was like, no, definitely was not. And he was like, are you sure? Like gonna, like, argue with her, right? Like, are you sure? She was like, no, I'm pretty sure. And so we kind of moved on. And then his wife comes up and is like, oh, I've met you before. I was like, oh, my God. What is happening right now? So I know for me, I need to unpack how to make I want my friends to feel safe in my house, and, like, I feel like it put them in a situation where they, like, weren't safe. So I know, like, I need to unpack what that looks like, and so for me, like, that's, like, my next step is, like, how do I deal with that in my own house? So I would like you guys to do this now, right? So go ahead, think about it, and then if you feel comfortable to share with kind of the people near you, let's just kind of, like, unpack, right? What was that first memory with race and racism? And then most recent, like, what have you most recently experienced? And then what's the significance of those, right? Like, what are you learning based on those experiences?
My second last came out. And I come here to run. And on the last lap around, second yard, he had nothing stopped, nothing up, I just kept running. And I feel he was doing my team. He just told me not to worry about it. So I was running about it. Yeah.
That's what we want. I guess one of my first memories and experiences with racism, I grew up in Jim Crow. So I've known nothing but racism.
Alright, take like 30 seconds. Finish your reference. Alright, so let's talk about, I don't want to necessarily make you all share, right, because those are pretty personal, and I'm already super excited you were able to talk about them with the people by you. But let's talk about experience, like what does this matter, right? Like what is the significance of these memories? And I've also noticed that we have different definitions, right? So when we're thinking about what race and racism is, that will also have a like spectrum, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So this is just rhetorically speaking, but race is a social construct.
Yep.
There is, I'm old, so when I was first in college,
32.
I had a degree in anthropology, and this was in the late 1970s. I was taking courses, and we were told that there were physiological boundaries of what race were. Well, since the mapping of the human genome, we know that those physiological constructs are not true, they're not accurate.
Yep.
Yet we are still stuck.
Mm-hmm.
We're still using the word race.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, in my opinion, we need to get rid of the word race. It's not real. It's a social construct. I don't know how we could rename it, but humans are humans. As Bill Nye used to say, we all have brown skin, just different shades. And so I just wanted to say that, and it's not part of what you're, but at some point, we need to move, because that traps us in a corner anyway, but yet we need to have the language to talk about it, so I just wanted to say that.
No, science teacher here, right? Absolutely, no biological differences between races. You're actually more likely to have more genetic material be similar to someone who is outside of your white, black, brown race than within one. But yeah, biological basis, absolutely not. But I like the definition of using social. Socially, it matters, right? Wrong, right, wrong. We want to move on from that, but we can't when our system is set up that way, right? So yeah, thinking about that as a social construct. Yes, thank you though for bringing that into here. That there is absolutely no biological basis to race. Go ahead.
It's the dichotomy, right? There's no biological difference in race, but there is a huge social construct that benefits some people over others, and so we can't not talk about it. And I'm on a school board, and I'm getting a ton of emails about critical race theory, critical race theory,
Yep.
as I'm sure you all are. And there's so many things I want to say about that, but we can't. But most of the tone of those emails is saying things like, we shouldn't be talking about race. They're using that argument as a club, right? We shouldn't be talking about race because it's not even a thing, but we should be talking about race because it is impacting everybody. And back to the original question, my first thought was, how much is race impacting me? And I thought 100%. And I thought, what a white response that is for me to think that race impacts my life 100%, meaning 100% of the time I don't have to worry. I could drive my car and do stupid stuff. I could go into a store and accidentally use a 20, a counterfeit 20, or steal a candy bar. That 100% of the time I'm going to be fine. And so it's a white response for me to think 100% of the time it affects my life, when really 0% of the time am I going to be held liable.
Negatively impacted.
Am I going to be negatively impacted by my race?
Yeah.
So interestingly, because I answered that question 100%, and I think it is 100% for me because I am white. That's how the race is impacting me. It's giving me all of that privilege, right? So I've come full circle over the past few years to think race doesn't matter, to say, oh, my race matters, and it gives me an enormous amount of privilege.
And responsibility.
And
Right,
responsibility.
that's,
Yes, yes.
that's the next page.
Yeah.
It is, yes, 100% of the time it does not affect me. So 100% of the time it's my responsibility to acknowledge that it doesn't affect me.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add anything to that?
Well, until the system of oppression is dismantled, we have to continue to talk about race, and only then can we start reframing the term race. We can't not talk about race until that system of oppression is dismantled.
And it's honestly God, why doesn't that click? Man! Okay. That actually leads us perfectly into, let's talk about how the system is set up, right? Because now we talked about that. There's a system set up that benefits white people and whiteness, and especially within, white culture. Now, this comes from, again, the Pacific Education Group, their Courageous Conversations About Race. I will admit, I've had this conversation with people that are not white, that some of these characteristics show up in other cultures. Yes, absolutely, I want to admit that and acknowledge that right away. But when we think about the dominant culture or the systems that are set up, so schools, especially since we're here to talk about schools, but schools, government, policing, the judicial system, oftentimes these are the things that matter or make the rules. Right, so you think about rugged individualism, you get what you deserve. Competition, school, class rank, right? What a competition. Justice, that, everything will always be fair and just. Communications, holidays, our school calendars are built around, like, Christian holidays. So what I want us to do is to start thinking about where these show up in ourselves, because they do show up in ourselves, right? Science teacher, emphasis on the scientific method was a hard one for me to, like, get over. Like, there are other ways to do science than the way that I have always done science, which is a very, like, Western culture, like, you do this and this and this and you get an answer and you go back, but not acknowledging there's other ways to do science. For me too, like, time and, like, being future oriented, like, those are all very instilled in me in, like, the way I was, like, brought up. And I'm also not saying any of this is, like, wrong, right? Like, if you as a person ascribes these ideas, also not a bad thing. When we're thinking of systems, how do we dismantle some of these things as barriers? So when I think about time, I think about, and not even, like, talking white culture, like, kid culture, right? Like, youth culture. Kids don't think coming to my class on time is, like, matters to them, right? They're more worried about their social life. And so we're, thinking about time as, like, a commodity, that, like, they're wasting my time. I'm giving them my time when I'm their teacher, is such a concept that, like, doesn't really benefit kids. Like, why is that beneficial to them? So thinking about things in a different way. So this is kind of where I want us to spend our last little bit of time, is thinking about where these show up in yourself and in school, or in our structures that are creating barriers for kids and for all kids, right? So when we're thinking of, like, I think about my two white boys that are 6 and 5, like, some of this they're not gonna be good at too, right? Like, sitting still, like, they just learned the, like, eyes are listening, or no, whatever the song is, right? Like, ears are listening, voice is quiet, body's calm. My 5-year-old cannot sit still. Like, that is not, he can listen and still be moving. So, like, why is that not honored in school? Like, why is he being forced to sit still and listen? Like, why is that the only way that we can listen? So just, that's kind of where I wanted us to finish. So we'll take, like, I think we're done at, like, 10:15. So we'll come back together maybe about, like, 10, 11, I can tell time. Hey, I had the 15 right, that was what mattered. Literally the 15. So, like, 11, 10-ish, we'll kind of come all back together and kind of and wrap it up. But so yeah, like, just thinking about what these characters just show up, and how do we dismantle that?
What do you mean by disrupt?
So how do we, like, disrupt this? So if competition, or, like, even, like, if you start with, like, rugged individualism in schools, that matters, right? Like, about kids who work for themselves, you earn your grades, you get what you deserve. How can we change that narrative? And is it something we have to change? Because not all of it, right? Like, time, asserting that time in school matters. That's not something we're going to change. And so thinking about what are these things that could be changed to benefit all kids.
I don't like those women.
Right, but when you think about, like, what society pushes as a beauty standard, I used to joke, I'm like, I got the blonde and the tall, but not the thing. Nobody's missing one of them. But right, like, how do we teach kids that beautiful? How do we teach our young girls that beautiful is all shades and colors and sizes? Like, how do we do that on a school? Because I feel like before they thought school, that wasn't school's job. And I think we've learned that school has taken on that job. Like, we need to take that on. We do not have, like, society, like, my kids. I listen to my 6-year-old when he was, like, 4, watching TV, and he goes, that's a girl's toy. Oh, I hate that. Why is that a girl's toy? Right? I was like, why is that a girl's toy? He goes, well, it's all pink, and there's girls on the TV. Oh, hell to the no. So I, like literally thought we drove the store, we bought said doll. Also, like, we bought a bunch of purple and pink shirts, and that's the thing what, like, I was like, man, like, we're just a racial I can point to them. I can point to that. I can say they saw the commercial, they see girls playing, they see pink, that's where that, like, connection was. So, like, where's the other stuff coming from? Like, how do I disrupt that? Like in schools, like, how do we disrupt that idea of this is what?
Yeah, number one is because I teach one value here, and mom is teaching do another one at home.
It's hard.
So it's very hard not to be correct. And at home, hey, when we have meetings, they make sure parents, hey, you know, this is something you Dad over here and say, no,
I think I have the advantage of being a high school teacher that I can, so I teach what institution I school inside. And the way that we do that is I know a lot of kids that, I don't say that. No. I say, here's an article, read this article, what did you learn from it? And so like they start reading these articles, they're talking about like Serena Williams almost died. Serena Williams, best athlete in the world, right? She had a baby. She told the nurses that they were not nurses, but she told the nurses that I don't feel right. There's something going on. I think she like threw a blood clot. She's like, I think I have a blood clot. I need you to look. I need you to do something. They said, you just had a baby. You're and then she threw a blood clot. So like they didn't believe it.
right.
And so, you know, so I started giving these examples. There were speakers that are women and people in healthcare and insurance. And then the kids are listening to me where I told them multiple perspectives. And you see how it's alternative perspectives and I was like, why is it all hard? Multiple perspectives. And then the kids go, ooh, there's something going on. Like, I think that people are maybe treated differently. And then we dive into like, there's probably socioeconomic difference too. And then we realize we can't pull apart, we can't pull the lives apart. So we talk like, well, what do we do? So a lot of my students will learn that. So like, well, when they get to it, we'll do like, and say, well, and why are we still teaching that black people kill black? That's tough, it's a metaphor. That their skin is thicker than white skin, so you have to like jab needles harder, but that's okay because they don't have
I didn't realize that. My son's an anesthesiologist. I've never even shared that. And he's been one for probably about 20 years now. But of course, I will never heard that. But this mattering starts with education and parenting of all these things. We gotta get on the same page. We gotta understand, have the same language so that our kids are not confused. You can want to be a doctor if you want to, but if you got this kid, well, now you have middle school, high school kids, so you're in a better place than I am. And so, because I wouldn't come to them with that, you know. And then, of course, my curriculum is more already chosen. You know, I can't just pull something. I got to do that. And I have parents that come to my customers and have lives, which got me in trouble, you know.
You read a book called Red. It's all about this friend who has a rapper that says red, but he's blue. So he's being told to draw strawberries, and they don't come out. They draw fire trucks, but they're blue. And then another crayon says, can you draw an ocean with my red? And then a little crayon red says, no, but I'm red. She's like, but I think it'll look fine. And so red draws blue ocean with this.
I need that book.
Oh, it's so good. Like, it's just so language.
I don't know, but I just think it will be awful, but I can find it. I'm a very good at
Written books and illustrated books that color indigenous stories, right? Like, I'm intentional. So then when my kids are reading books and looking at books, so like,
and culture.
yes.
Values that may not be the same as theirs, but that doesn't make them a less person.
There's a book about Diwali. There's a book about Diwali. It's an Indian We're not teaching it. We're teaching it. That's how many jobs.
Yeah.
We're talking about how, like in my class, like,
You know it.
it's happening.
You know it. That's exactly right.
But it's a conversation. We're just going to build that. Like I have neighbors that want to go to party because they first have been arrested. I have like final matters. And I was the burden. But they have when you come in, what is
And still people don't want to accept some of that either.
I'm just like, see?
That's probably the thing. If you don't meet your goals and you didn't work hard enough, that's, that's one that really didn't leave this man. I had my oldest granddaughter, just graduated from medical school. I'm not medical school, Prairie College at Howard University. She wanted to be a doctor, dad's a doctor. And she didn't get accepted. So she graduated in 2020. She went right into medical school, but didn't get accepted yet. Well, just got accepted. But her dad was saying all the time, just because you didn't get accepted does not mean that you're not good or you won't be the best doctor. But the doctor may not even be your own, So he was really excited to make her feel comfortable and good about that, So I think that would need to be dismantled for sure. But I'm a little bit concerned about work before play. I'm concerned about being work before play. I guess that's sticking out now. It can be play before work, play, but I do believe, the balance.
To me, that like goes under like and like more like work to like need to work and then you down. So like now that like that's
that's why we are because all the work had to be done first.
I love this one commercial that comes on where mom says, you can't get up from the table until you finish your vegetable. And the little girl goes, well, I'll get fine, I'll just sleep in. I like that one all the time. I use that all the time, Then finally mom finds,
And we all have our places. So if I don't like
this was like, she managed to do it forever. So I'm gonna make her this dinner. I'm gonna do this for her. And my husband and I will look at it and go, I should know that. But I understand. I get it. Yes. I'm not making it. Or tonight is your special night, and we'll sit down and we'll have meals together with you. Yes, that's right. Yes, I know that constant rule ethnic is just really hurting our kids. And even so, right here in school, when they buy the lunches and all, especially elementary school, everybody does the same thing. They have salad bars, things like that, and and we have, but that trait that I did, okay, it's the same thing. So even within this structure,
So if you're gonna, you have to eat what's there.
you gotta eat from
Why is it different? Eat, so then like, I'm like, you're on my lunch.
yeah, you have lunch, right? It's not. Yeah. Yeah, I tried them. Same thing, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So all this stuff is really structural, and it's hard to turn out the structure that's been in place for so long that I don't even think we even think about it. Because you know where they say that you're going. You know, somebody doing something.
They don't start with
You never had enough of anything. Yes. Wealth, power, heavy value on ownership, respect authority, you know, I think especially that heavy value on ownership, that's important, but not to use, not for pushing so much, but that is something that you're gonna, I mean, my husband pushes that a lot, you know, you need land, you need property, you need this, you need that. I'm not so sure that I would want that this matter. Because you do, you know, I don't know about that.
Alright, I hate to cut you all, I'm gonna bring you back, and we're just gonna finish out, kind of thinking it together.
Some of the necessities.
So we're gonna come back and think together just what do we do next, right? So, you know, digging into your own racial consciousness, thinking about like what are the next steps. So, you know, what are within our sphere of influence to change. I know for me that was a hard one to learn, and I think I have to relearn it every year. I'm like, I want to change the system right now, and I, as a classroom teacher, am not capable of doing it, right? So like, I can change my own classroom, I can have some influence in my department, maybe my building, but like, marching down to district office and telling them what to do is not going to help, right? So what do you have, like, what is in your sphere of influence to change? And then just thinking about your own goals, you know, like, is it a book? But when I say read a book, and I read lots and lots of books, it's never just read a book though, right? Like, what are you gonna do with it? What are you learning? What resources are you gaining from said book? Yeah?
I just wanna, I don't want to, sorry to interrupt you,
You're
I just
good.
wanna say to everybody, one thing that I think that everybody can do is submit a public comment to your school board in support of racial education, comprehensive
Yes.
racial education, because I will tell you that we are getting a ton of messages
Yeah.
about how we should not be talking about it. And those people are speaking up very loudly, and so if you feel
That's a good
like
point.
having these conversations and supporting your district to include curriculum that is racially responsible, then I highly ask that you submit a comment to your public school board.
And don't be scared to do it as a
Those
teacher.
will say how you do it on the website.
Yep.
Yeah, you're probably gonna have to give your name and address.
Yep.
Which is another white supremacist, like, whatever.
Correct.
But, that would be my suggestion, and to tell everybody you know,
Yeah.
who feels that this is important, to tell them to submit comment to their phone.
And don't be afraid to do it as a teacher, right? Like, I have the privilege of being a teacher, but also a parent and community member in this school district, so sometimes they get two from me, like one is like the staff member and then one is the parent. One's usually sassier than the other. Because I'm like, I'm a parent, don't yell at me. But yeah, like, you know, standing up for that is something that I've had to learn to do, like, to stand up more in the community-wise. Like, putting those yard signs in your yard, that feels so performative to me oftentimes, but I found that in my subdivision, I live in a subdivision that most of the houses are in family trusts. I don't know if any of you know what that means. It means they're elderly and very conservative. Like, my Black Lives Matter sign is the topic of conversation still today. Like, it has been over a year, and they are still, like, offended by it. But so using that, you know, your sphere of influence, like, what can you influence? Like, who can you talk to? Yes, writing letters to your school board is something that you need to do.
Constantly.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, just thinking about what can you do next. And then I always, my gosh, how many times do I do that before I remember? All right. Then these are just some of those things that I recommend. Again, like, so books, absolutely, books are great. I love books. Right now I'm reading The Sum of Us. I just lost the name of the author.
Heather McGee.
Yes, thank you. It was right on the top. It is so good, but it is hard to read. Yes, it is really good. I would really recommend these podcasts too. I've really gotten into podcasts lately because I can like do my yard work or work out or whatever and listen. Seeing White podcast through Seen on Radio, like transformative. They really dig into the like how whiteness is pervasive in our society and how our society is built on racism. That's their second season. Their third season is about men and like gender norms, and then their fourth season was about democracy. So like I am their biggest fan. Also, Sounds Like Hate is another like transformative one. It talks about like how like white supremacy groups are grabbing our youth and what that looks like, and like hate groups. Talks about schools. It kind of has a lot of different avenues that they go. So podcasts I'm like super into right now, and those are the ones that I would super recommend. Just kind of keep along this journey and thinking, you know, digging more into yourself and how you kind of fit into the world. So my email is on there. That's a link to the presentation if you would like it. Oh, if you're looking for a place to buy books, don't use Amazon because they're the devil. Sorry, that was on the recording, wasn't it? Oh well. My favorite bookstore is Itty Bitty Bookstore out of Stoughton. She was a teacher, or she was a youth advocate and a graduate of Prairie High School. So she's one of my really good friends, Dominique Johnson, and you can buy them like online. And she has bookshop, so you can like buy any book.
She delivers.
Yes, and she delivers. I know she did like a date with a book, and she brought it to my house, and they were like the best books I would have never chose for myself. So that's a plug for her as well. That's all I got for y'all. Thank you so much for coming. If you